Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 488, One Shot, One Kill, the Snipers of the Eastern Front. We've all heard something akin to, for every job, there's the right tool. But believe it or not, the majority of snipers during World War II used the same rifles as their infantry comrades, though some would modify the optic sights. In other words, the mass-produced multi-purpose rifles did the job, which speaks to the design and the building of such guns. But again, actually pulling the trigger while aiming at an enemy combative was only a slice of what these men and women did during the war. Ironically, or not, keen eyesight was all that was needed, in most cases, because things like telescopic sights were nice, but they forced the sniper to expose more of their head when using it or firing. Most would rather have a spotter with a pair of binoculars as a guide. As we will see, it was the less exposed, the better. Strangely, as World War II created the conditions for FDR to create the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA, as the U.S. was not actively fighting yet, America did not train any troops for the sole purpose of sniping, though its infantry platoons did often have sharpshooters who pretty much functioned as snipers. These designated sharpshooters, as they were known, sometimes used the Springfield 30-06 rifles with optic sights, but many of them prefer the semi-automatic M1 Garand made by the Canadian-American John Garand, which they liked because of its long sight radius, which made for more accurate shooting. Basically, a long sight radius refers to the distance between the rear and front sight of the firearm. The longer the barrel, the more time there is generated to stabilize the bullet. It's worth noting that the M1 replaced the bolt-action M103 Springfield rifle used by the military in 1936, but the M1 itself was replaced by the M14 rifle in 1958. Thus, it was the M1 Garand that got the U.S. through World War II. But before we get too technical, let's go back in time. Hunting is a popular sport. Well, for some, it is not a sport, but a way to put food on the table. As for the English gentlemen of times past, the prime game bird was the snipe, and by the late 1700s, to go hunting for them was called sniping. They are rather small and fast, so to hit one required skill. Over time, these two ideas would be joined. To be able to hit a small target or a specific point of a target from far away would be called sniping. On a less pleasant note for the English, come British, as touching this subject, during the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, where the British Empire and the two Boer republics were contesting the empire's influence in South Africa, the British would find that most of the local farmers there were very good with their guns, because they had to be. By the time the fighting was over there were 7,582 British battle casualties, and 10% of those were officers, many of them taken out by snipers. To some, this was simply not cricket, but times, they were a-changing. Going back a bit further for a second, around the time of the U.S. Civil War, the term sharpshooter was being used by the military, but as the saying goes, the only constant is change. By the First World War, military conflict had altered considerably due to technology. The machine gun did much to deter mass charges, thus the trench system was created to counter it. And those in the know the phrase, 3 on a match, as in, if 3 soldiers lit their cigarettes from the same match, one of those 3 might be shot by someone looking for such a thing with a rifle in their hands. Since World War II, the U.S. military has always had a sniper contingent. Think of snipers as the first precision weapon. A specific person or object can be targeted and collateral damage can be minimized, which suits the modern world. But a sniper is much more than a person with a gun and is very good at putting a projectile into a small spot from far away. If anything, that is the end or almost the end of the entire process. There is so much more that goes into getting to that moment. There are the skills of observation, communications, and concealment that also have to be mastered. In fact, a sniper's primary job is to gather intelligence beyond the battle line. For example, to call in the location of a high-value target. But most times, they simply gather intelligence or watch over their comrades. When it does come time to shoot, they can end the enemy's building attack by taking out a certain person or a piece of equipment. They can visit death upon a person or an entire operation. That's being a true force multiplier, which is essentially what a sniper is. Small teams able to make big differences on the battlefield. But what their comrades appreciate most about snipers is when they are performing blocking actions, basically helping to defend a unit, usually from high above and from an unknown position. In the military, snipers are volunteers, qualified as expert marksmen, the highest ranking, and that's just to qualify for training as a sniper. But like most special forces, most wash out, as its demands are absolute. Simply because sniper candidates have to be able to carry out their functions amongst diverse environments. They have to master fieldcraft skills, camouflage techniques, target detection, range estimation, and all this under intense pressure. After all, someone is also out there looking to kill them. Of course, when people imagine snipers, what is conjured up is a roughly human shape in a ghillie suit, i.e., covered with items that not only break up their form, but help them fit into their environment. Their rifle gets this treatment as well. Of course, during World War II, and certainly on the Eastern Front, the sniper's concealment pretty much came down to earthly patterns within their clothing, or all-white suits to protect them from and blend in with the snow. The fancy strips of cloth all over, that comes a little later. Not unlike the fancy strips of cloth, during World War II, sniping was kept to the basics, certainly for Soviet Russia in dealing with Operation Barbarossa. Eventually, there would be some 2,000 women trained in Russia in the art of sniping, but many of those were before the Germans came at Moscow. To be sure, there were more male snipers than female in Soviet Russia, but some of these women would go on to be hailed as heroes, doing their part to stop the invaders.
Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.
Indeed, Soviet Russia's sniper program in between the wars was more aggressive than anyone else's for one specific reason: experience, or rather being on the wrong end of a sniper's rifle. And this experience came from the Spanish Civil War, but mostly from the Winter War, in where Finnish snipers downed over 1,000 Soviet soldiers of all ranks. Of course, the greatest sniper the Finns had during the Winter War was Simo Häyhä, who had killed at least 505 Soviet troops. During that conflict, the Finns were more than ready. They had expert marksmen on skis, using the terrain for camouflage and constantly moving after each shot, not unlike hunting. Again, the only word to describe Russia's pre-war sniper program would be robust. By 1938, some 6 million Russians qualified as a sharpshooter. No, most of these people were not true snipers, but they had the basics down and trained other younger people who had the other skills needed. That same year, 1938, Soviet Russia made 53,000 Mosin Nagant sniper rifles. By 1942, they were making that same number each year, and Nazi Germany would feel the effects. And as the Germans learned when they invaded Soviet Russia, there was much more to a sniper than just accuracy. In September 1941, with Barbarossa just 4 months old, the German 465th Infantry Regiment lost 75 men in mere hours to one Soviet sniper. The Germans, crouched down, looking all over, started calling this threat the tree sniper, but honestly, they had no idea where he was, and they never found him. That spoke to the sniper's camouflage and woodcraft. But there was another quality about Soviet snipers that the invaders would come to fear: their ability to endure the unendurable just to get the shot. A panzer unit was resting after a hard day's slog when one of their numbers fell to a sniper's bullet. The men panicked and started looking around, yet they could not pinpoint the threat, and members of the panzer team kept falling. And this went on for 5 days. But one morning, a German soldier spotted smoke coming from a destroyed T-34 tank. As it was their only lead, they rushed the tank. The sniper was not there, but he had been there. The Germans surmised that not only had the sniper hid inside the tank, ignoring the corpses around him and the resulting smell, but he had also eaten their rations and used his body warmth to thaw out their water canteens. That was dedication. That was duty. But for many of the Soviet soldiers, it was simply revenge, delivered any way they could. The schools that produced these snipers were started in the 1930s, and Red Army doctrine demanded that snipers work in pairs, which is common today. One was the eyes for the other, the shooter. They took turns with this, and one was always awake or took over when the other suffered fatigue from straining their eyes for too long. And while Soviet claims as for the number of the victims of their snipers is probably exaggerated, these men and women were force multipliers and gave the Wehrmacht troops many a sleepless night. It will come as no surprise that as Barbarossa wore on and the Germans suffered heavy losses, some due to enemy snipers, that more Axis snipers were sent east. 3 of those were of the 3rd Mountain Division: Matthias Herznauer, who had 345 kills, Sepp Auerberger, who had 257 kills, and Helmut Winsberger, who had 64 kills. The first 2, they were the most successful German snipers on the Eastern Front. Their weapon of choice was the Mauser-designed K98 rifle with telescopic sights, and they were a part of a battalion sniper group, but their immediate unit was of 22 men, all broken down into teams of 2. Unless given a specific target or task, their priority of targets were as follows: elimination of observers, the enemy's heavy weapons, and commanders. Specific orders were often given to take out anti-tank gun positions, machine gun positions, and any other immediate threat to that day's plan of attack. After the war, Hetzenauer would say that his scariest moments, besides going after Soviet snipers, was crawling past the battle line, as the following day his side would be opening up with an artillery barrage. The Soviets had more artillery pieces than any other country, and when the artillery duel got underway, it was Hetzenauer's job to take out enemy gun crews or observers to help even the odds. And factoring in snipers, the 900-day siege of Leningrad makes a lot more sense from the moment that city was not taken during the early days of the invasion. Once the battle line settled down, not that there weren't shells thrown by the opposing sides, the Russians settled into the mud or dirt, ever waiting for the next attack. And with them were their snipers. After some hours, the infantry would grow tired or bored, or they would stretch out, but not the snipers. An important part of the Soviet sniper training program was to move was to die. Yes, these men and women were also tired. They also got stiff, but they were disciplined. Let the other side make the first and probably last mistake of their lives. Despite the rain or the snow, these soldiers of stone were ever watchful, ready to strike. But even before the end of 1941, the Soviet snipers had become heroes of the country, thanks to their deeds, but also because of Soviet propaganda, as the people needed something to believe in. So when an 18-year-old Soviet infantry soldier got up the nerve to speak to a sniper to ask questions, turns out most of the snipers came from farms, where they had to learn to shoot straight at a young age to protect the family or the flock from a different kind of predator.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
But one of Soviet Russia's most successful snipers was self-taught and took part in the Battle of Moscow in 1941 and 42. His name was Ivan Sidorenko. He was a peasant who only completed 10 grades of schooling and before the war wanted to be an artist. Turns out his art would be something altogether different. In 1939, while at the Penza Art College near Moscow, he was conscripted into the Red Army. His infantry training was in the Crimean Peninsula to be a part of a mortar unit. Basically, his job was to load, unload, and then reload shells into the team's tubed gun on a tripod. Next, they would carry the mortar and shells to another location and start over again, to either keep the enemy back or to soften up the enemy before they were attacked. It was straightforward work, but grueling, and Sidorenko wanted to do more to help defend his country should that time come. It did. Fast forward to 1941, Ivan Sidorenko's unit was a part of the defensive ring around Moscow. He did his part with his mortar team, but again wanted to do more. So during his off time, he would take his Mosin-Nagant rifle, standard issue, which had a magazine capacity of 5 rounds, and he would go out hunting for the enemy near the city's edge. The Mosin-Nagant rifle was accurate up to 550 yards, so Ivan's thinking was, I will fire from far away to stay as safe as possible. But when he got a telescopic sight put on it, he felt he could hit targets from perhaps 875 yards away, thus being ever safer. For all of Soviet Russia's sniper schools throughout the country, Ivan never attended any of them, but as he went out when he could, it turns out he was a natural, and at first simply focused on stealth and spent his time watching the enemy. Gathering intelligence is always the first order of business. Gaining in confidence each night, he soon started picking out targets and then silencing them. Getting better each time, he soon started focusing on enemy tankers and supply vehicles, taking them out with explosive rounds. As Napoleon once said, an army lives on its stomach, and the Germans were not getting as many supplies as they should have. As his number of kills increased, not to mention that he came back alive each time after engaging the enemy, his superiors removed him from the mortar unit and had him train other would-be snipers. But should this podcaster be asked, "Are you ready to learn?" the answer would have been a very humble "Niet." For Ivan's way of teaching his students was to take these young men out and basically push them into the water. He drove home his philosophy, one shot, one kill. As in, once you fire, that's it. Everyone's looking for you, including the opposing snipers. So the setup is paramount. Don't rush and simply hope for the best. During one such outing, Sidorenko and his student came upon 3 trucks protected by a panzer. Putting 5 explosive bullets into his gun, Sidorenko quickly fired 4 of them, and each one hit their target. After leaving the area, the student asked, "Why didn't Sidorenko fire the 5th bullet?" His teacher answered, "That was to protect me in case he was attacked. Always have a plan, and that plan should always include making minimum movements when in doubt." Hence, he would not have to reload and then move, still having that one single bullet. The Sidorenko students had the desired effect, taking out enemy combatants and their equipment. In response, the Germans flooded the area with their own snipers. But as Ivan emphasized stealth, camouflage, and being sure before making a move, the Germans were frustrated in their attempts. And not only did Sidorenko teach his students to use everything around them, snow, trees, or even the remains of a building to camouflage oneself with, he also taught them how to counter the German snipers. When it became clear that there was an increase in Axis snipers around the Moscow area, Sidorenko started using decoys to snoop out the opposing gunmen. Sometimes these decoys were picked out by the Germans, but even then, Sidorenko would simply outweight them, even if it required days. He saw this as an investment that would not only keep him alive, but would eventually hand the enemy a loss of one of their highly trained snipers. But as the threat to the Soviet capital decreased, Sidorenko would go out less, and he would teach more. In time, he trained over 250 students who had their own impact on the Eastern Front. Taking it even further, as several large Soviet cities were contested during the war, Sidorenko organized sniper battalions to work together in urban areas or forests to maximize not only enemy losses, but to make them fear the very idea that somewhere out there was a Soviet sniper. Yet in 1944, Ivan's time as a sniper came to a close when he was injured by an exploding shell. Still, he taught others what he had taught himself back in 1941, which started with being bored, loading and reloading mortars, which was fortunate for his country, obviously. Sidorenko was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, his country's highest honor, and he was also awarded the Order of Lenin and the Order of the Red Banner. With over 500 kills, even if this number is inflated, his contribution to the war effort was one of a kind. When the war ended, Sidorenko moved to the Ural Mountains and worked as a foreman of a coal mine. 20 years later, he moved again and retired. Ivan Sidorenko died on February 19, 1994. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So, that was kind of a standalone episode. We'll get back to the Eastern Front next time. And I also have a book interview that I'll throw in there as well. I'll do another 2-episode special. Anyway, so as far as saying hello to my latest members, I'd like to say hello to Cameron Hart from Manitoba, Canada. Thank you, Cameron. And to someone, if they put their name, I missed it, I apologize. CRS Systems in County Cork, UK. So thank you very much for becoming members. And there was one donation from Miles Cardinal, who has, I've been told, really good taste in podcasts and a beautiful wife. His words, not mine. Hopefully that gets you out of trouble, Miles. Anyway, so thank you for listening. And again, I have other standalone episodes I will sprinkle in, but next time we will definitely get back to the war as the Germans are retreating from Moscow and Stalin wants to push them, but Zhukov is trying to restrain his master. We'll see what happens. Take care, everyone.
Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.